Why elephants remember you. The ground is shaking before the sound even arrives. 11,000 pounds of gray muscle is barreling toward you across dry savanna, ears flared out like sails, trunk curled up tight against her chest. Dust kicks up behind her in a wall. Every instinct in your body is screaming the same word, and that word is run. You don't run. You can't. Your legs have apparently filed a formal complaint, gone on strike. 20 feet away, she stops. Just stops. Dead silent, dust still settling around her ankles like the world's worst confetti. She stares at you for 3 long seconds, then she lowers her head, exhales through her trunk hard enough to part your hair, and walks away like nothing happened. That wasn't an attack, that was a test. And apparently, I passed. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up here. Oh, hey there. I should clarify something right away because I can already feel you bracing for a sad ending. That mock charge isn't the thing that got me. I lived through that one. What actually got me came later, and it involved a different elephant, a much worse decision on my part, and roughly 4 seconds of regret so intense I'm fairly sure it's the reason I'm still hanging around the afterlife instead of moving on to whatever's next. We'll get there. Death has taught me a lot of things, but the #1 lesson is this. Patience is free when you've got eternity, so let's earn this story properly. I've spent more time than I can count standing in the grass next to elephant herds, invisible, unbothered, occasionally heckled by birds who can apparently sense a ghost is nearby and find it hilarious. And in all that time, the thing that still stops me cold isn't their size or their strength or the fact that they can apparently detect water from underground using their feet like seismic listening devices. It's their memory, because elephants don't just remember things, they remember you, specifically, by smell, by sound, by the exact way you walked away from them 3 years ago. And once you understand how that memory actually works, you start to realize humans have been getting this whole story wrong for a very long time. Which brings us to something even stranger. Myth 1. Elephants never forget. True or false? Verdict? Technically true, hilariously incomplete. It's not that elephants have some magical unlimited memory bank where every blade of grass they've ever seen gets filed away forever. It's that elephant memory is built around exactly one priority: relationships and threats. Everything else is negotiable. You could spend a week walking next to an elephant, and if you're boring, polite, and irrelevant, you might barely register. But threaten her calf once, even briefly, even accidentally, and you've just been issued a permanent reservation in her long-term memory. No cancellation policy, no refunds. Researchers studying herds in Amboseli National Park, one of the longest-running elephant studies on Earth, decades of data on known individuals, found that elephants can distinguish between human ethnic groups associated with past conflict just from clothing color and language patterns played through speakers. Maasai men, historically more likely to spear elephants in retaliation for cattle conflicts, triggered defensive bunching and retreat behavior. Kamba men, who posed less historical threat, didn't get the same reaction. The elephants weren't reacting to humans in general. They were reacting to a category of danger, built from generations of accumulated experience. Let that sink in for a second. These animals built a functioning threat assessment system based on culturally specific historical risk, using scent and voice as the input. That's not instinct, that's institutional memory. Evolution looked at the idea of grudge holding and said, yeah, actually, let's make that a survival trait. Fast fact 1, elephant brains weigh around 11 pounds, the largest brain of any land animal, and the hippocampus, the memory and emotion processing center, is proportionally larger relative to body size than in humans. You've got a bigger brain in absolute terms. They've got more dedicated real estate for remembering who hurt them and who didn't. But before we get to the why, let's talk about the how, because the mechanics of this thing are genuinely bizarre. Here's where nature gets weird. Humans are visual creatures. We recognize faces first. Elephants barely bother with your face at all. Their primary recognition system runs almost entirely on scent and infrasound, and the trunk is doing about 90% of the heavy lifting. An elephant's trunk contains somewhere around 40,000 individual muscles, no bone, just layered, overlapping muscle bundles working in coordination, which is roughly 40,000 more muscles than your entire arm has, in case you needed another reason to feel personally inadequate today. This trunk can detect chemical signatures at concentrations low enough to identify a specific individual elephant's urine from over 100 feet away, distinguishing it from a near-identical relative's urine on the same patch of ground. Imagine being able to walk into a parking lot and identify your coworker's car by smelling the exhaust. That's the baseline skill level we're discussing. This is why an elephant can recognize a person they met once, years prior, without ever looking directly at them. You don't have to make eye contact to be remembered. You just have to exist within smelling range long enough to get filed. What is actually going through its head?
This part matters, so let's be precise about what's known versus what's likely. It is documented repeatedly in controlled studies that elephants can distinguish between scent samples of known and unknown individuals, and that they respond differently to scent or skin oils of family members versus strangers. It is also documented that elephants show physiological stress responses, elevated heart rate, defensive posturing, sometimes years afterwards. What is hypothesized, because we obviously can't run a survey, is the emotional texture of that memory.
Researchers generally avoid claiming elephants experience grudges in the human sense, since that implies a level of narrative self-reflection we can't directly measure. What we can say confidently is this: the memory is specific, durable, and behaviorally consequential. Whether she's replaying the moment in her head like a courtroom drama or simply running an automatic threat-tagged scent protocol, the result for you is the same. She remembers. Act accordingly. Speaking of terrible decisions, let's talk about the moment that actually ended me. I want to be upfront that this story does not reflect well on me. I was young, mildly arrogant, and operating under the deeply human assumption that confidence counts as competence. I had spent 2 weeks near a herd, mostly observing from a respectful distance, and I had developed what I can only describe as premature familiarity with one particular matriarch. She'd let me get closer than the others tolerated. I decided this meant we had a bond. She decided I was simply boring enough not to bother chasing off yet. One afternoon, I closed that distance further than I should have, camera in hand, convinced my 2 weeks of good behavior had earned me trust I hadn't actually earned. She didn't charge, she didn't trumpet a warning, she simply turned in one smooth motion and swept her trunk sideways with the casual efficiency of someone swatting a fly off a porch railing. I happened to be standing where the fly would have been. There was a tree involved on the way down. I won't elaborate further, mostly because the details are embarrassing and partly because elaborating requires reliving it, and I've relived it enough times in the afterlife already, thanks. Here's the thing that still gets me, though. She wasn't being malicious. From her perspective, I'd been quietly tolerated for 2 weeks straight, and then I made one unannounced fast movement too close to her family. That's not betrayal, that's just bad math on my part. I treated a wild animal's patience like it was a subscription service instead of a daily renewal. Reality check. According to data compiled by wildlife conflict researchers across African and Asian elephant range states, the vast majority of fatal elephant encounters with humans involve animals that had prior negative experiences with people, poaching attempts, habitat encroachment, vehicle collisions, rather than random, unprovoked aggression. To put that in a frame you can actually feel, it's less wild animal randomly snaps and more person walks into the one bar in town where everyone already remembers exactly what they did last time. The elephant isn't the unpredictable variable here. We are. Which brings us to something I find genuinely beautiful underneath all the dark comedy. Elephants engage in behavior around the remains of dead elephants that researchers still don't fully understand, and honestly, neither do I, despite having unlimited free time to watch it happen. When a herd encounters the bones or carcass of another elephant, even one they didn't personally know, they often stop. They investigate with their trunks, touching the skull and tusks specifically, sometimes for extended periods, sometimes returning to the same set of bones on separate occasions, weeks or months apart. What's especially strange is the specificity. Studies using presented bone samples found elephants spend significantly more time investigating elephant skulls and ivory than they do investigating the skulls of other large mammals like rhinos or buffalo, placed in the same area under the same conditions. They're not generally curious about death, they're specifically oriented toward their own kind. Is this grief in the way you'd recognize it? Scientists are careful here, and so should you be. Known, elephants showed distinct behavioral changes around their own dead: investigative touching, unusual quietness, lingering. Likely, there's some form of recognition occurring, given the species-specific focus. Hypothesized and contested that this constitutes anything resembling human grief or mourning ritual. We don't actually know what's happening internally. What we know is that something is happening, and it's not nothing, and it's specific enough that it should make you reconsider every documentary that's ever flattened elephants into background scenery for a Savanna sunset shot. Fast fact 2. There are field-documented cases of elephant mothers carrying or guarding the bodies of dead calves for days, refusing to leave the area, sometimes physically supporting the body upright.
Researchers studying these events have explicitly declined to call it mourning with full scientific confidence, while also declining to call it nothing. Sometimes science's most honest answer is we don't know, but we're not going to pretend we do either. Let's lighten this back up before I start writing the eulogy for the entire elephant species, because that's not the energy we came here for. You're standing in a research vehicle, parked at a respectful distance, watching a young bull approach the herd's matriarch for the first time in months. He's recently left the bachelor group he was traveling with, full of confidence, full of testosterone, absolutely certain he's ready for whatever comes next. He approaches with his head up, ears slightly forward, the elephant equivalent of walking into a job interview wearing sunglasses indoors. The matriarch turns. She doesn't charge him, she doesn't even raise her trunk. She simply ignores him for 40 straight minutes, continuing to feed as though he's a particularly uninteresting shrub. Eventually, he lowers his head, drops his ears, and backs off entirely, joining the herd's periphery instead of the center. That wasn't rejection out of cruelty, that was rank assessment, and he failed it on the spot. Elephant society runs on a strict, well-documented hierarchy, almost entirely organized around age and experience, rather than size or aggression. The oldest matriarchs, not the strongest individuals, the oldest and most experienced, make the group's major decisions, including where to find water during drought years, based on memories of droughts decades earlier that younger elephants never personally lived through. Evolution breakdown: why would a species evolve to value memory over muscle in its leadership structure? Because in a drought, brute strength doesn't locate water, information does. A study tracking matriarch age against herd survival during severe East African drought years found families led by older matriarchs, those who had personally lived through a previous multi-decade drought cycle, had significantly higher calf survival rates than families led by younger matriarchs without that specific memory. The older female wasn't stronger.
She just remembered where the emergency water was from a drought that happened before most of her herd was even born. Evolution looked at respect your elders and decided, in this specific case, to make it a literal matter of life and death. This is less majestic wild kingdom and more the entire company survives because one employee still remembers where the backup server is from 1997. Scenario drop. You're a young elephant. Drought has dried up every familiar watering hole you've ever known. Panic would be the human response. Instead, you simply follow the oldest female in your family because somewhere in her decades of accumulated memory is a route to water that hasn't been used in years but was never forgotten. You're not following strength, you're following a hard drive with tusks. Fast fact 3. Elephants are one of a small handful of species, alongside humans, certain whales, and a few primates, known to undergo extended post-reproductive lifespans, meaning females can live decades past their fertile years. The leading hypothesis for why evolution would preserve non-reproductive elderly females in a population is essentially this exact memory function. They're walking survival archives, and keeping them alive benefits the whole group even after they stop producing calves themselves. Let's talk about something documentary narrators almost never explain properly: the infrasound thing. Elephants communicate using infrasound, extremely low-frequency rumbles well below the range of human hearing that can travel through the ground and through air for several miles under the right atmospheric conditions. You could be standing 30 feet from two elephants having what amounts to a full conversation, and you would hear absolutely nothing, while they're exchanging detailed information about identity, location, reproductive status, and apparently who's still mad at whom. Here's the part that gets overlooked constantly. Elephants don't just send these rumbles, they receive them partly through their feet. The soles of an elephant's feet and the bones in their legs are sensitive to ground vibration, allowing them to detect seismic signals from calls made by other elephants up to several miles away, well beyond the range the sound would travel reliably through open air alone. They're essentially listening with their skeleton. Researchers have documented elephants reacting to recorded calls of specific known individuals, close relatives versus distant acquaintances versus strangers, played back through speakers with measurably different responses depending on the relationship. Calls from a known family member prompted relaxed investigative behavior. Calls from unfamiliar elephants prompted defensive bunching. They were identifying specific individuals by voice alone, transmitted partly through the ground without seeing them at all. Myth 2. Elephants communicate mainly through trumpeting. True or false?
Verdict: false, and it's not particularly close. Trumpeting is the equivalent of a human shouting in surprise or excitement, dramatic, memorable, and statistically rare. The overwhelming majority of elephant communication happens in that low rumble register you can't hear at all, constantly throughout the day, like a group chat running in a frequency your phone can't pick up. Every dramatic trumpet you've seen in a documentary represents a tiny, unrepresentative fraction of how these animals actually talk to each other. And that's only half the story, because the memory piece compounds with this communication system in a way that's genuinely strange to think about. Because elephants can recognize dozens, possibly over 100 individual voices through infrasound, and because each elephant maintains specific memories of specific relationships, herds function less like a collection of individual animals and more like a distributed memory network. Information about threats, water sources, and unfamiliar humans can propagate through a population partly through direct experience and partly through behavioral cues picked up from herd members who did have the direct experience. This means an elephant who never personally encountered you can still treat you with caution, having picked up defensive signaling from a herd member who did. Your reputation can precede you through an information network you can't hear, using a sense organ in their feet transmitted by animals you've never even met. Reality check. Conservationists working in regions with high human-elephant conflict have observed that elephant herds in areas with frequent poaching pressure show measurably more defensive and avoidance behavior around humans generally, not just around the specific individuals involved in poaching incidents, suggesting the threat information genuinely spreads through the population's collective behavior, not just through the directly affected individual's personal memory. Fast fact 4. Some researchers studying this phenomenon have informally compared it to a rudimentary form of cultural transmission, not genetic, not instinctual, but learned and passed along through social structure, the same broad category of process by which human communities pass down warnings about dangerous places without every individual member needing to personally test the danger first. Let's pump the brakes on the heavy stuff for a second and talk about something genuinely ridiculous. Here's a question that doesn't get asked enough. If elephants can hold individual specific memories for years, even decades, how exactly are they managing the storage? You and I struggle to remember where we left our car keys 40 minutes ago, and these animals are apparently maintaining a multi-decade mental Rolodex of every threatening human, every related elephant, every drought-era water source, cross-referenced by smell, sound, and visual cue. The honest answer is researchers don't fully know the internal mechanics, but the proportionally massive hippocampus is the leading physical explanation, combined with a social structure that constantly reinforces and refreshes key memories through repeated contact with family members over years. It's less a static archive and more a living document, constantly being updated and reinforced through real social interaction, the same way you remember your closest friends' faces better than a stranger you met at a party because you keep seeing your friends.
This is the part where I have to admit something slightly embarrassing about my own death. The elephant who ended me wasn't malicious, wasn't holding a grudge, hadn't been wronged by me in some dramatic prior encounter. I was just an unfamiliar, fast-moving thing that got too close too suddenly to a family she was actively protecting. If I'd given her even 3 more days of boring, predictable behavior before closing that final distance, the refresh cycle of her trust assessment might have actually worked in my favor. Instead, I tried to skip the line. Evolution does not appreciate line skipping. Exception. Here's where the rule breaks, because nature loves nothing more than making you feel confident right before yanking the rug out. Not every elephant maintains long-term grudges against humans equally. Orphaned elephants raised in rehabilitation and reintroduction programs, having lost their original matriarchal memory network entirely, sometimes show notably different, often more tolerant behavior patterns around humans than wild-raised elephants with intact multi-generational social memory. The elephants never forget humans wronged them rule depends heavily on whether there was an intact social structure available to do the remembering and the teaching in the first place. Break the family network, and in some documented cases, you also break the inherited caution, which is its own quietly devastating fact if you sit with it for a second. The very thing that makes elephant memory so remarkable is also the thing poaching specifically destroys, generation by generation. Let's take a breath. I promise we're heading back toward funnier territory.
Field researchers and longtime safari guides working in regions with decades of continuous elephant observation have reported specific individual elephants showing what looks suspiciously like targeted, delayed response avoidance or aggression toward specific vehicles, specific clothing colors, or specific individual researchers, sometimes years after a single negative encounter, like a darting for veterinary treatment or a relocation procedure. This is harder to verify with the same rigor as the controlled scent and playback studies, so treat it as a well-documented anecdotal pattern rather than confirmed peer-reviewed finding. But the pattern shows up often enough, across enough independent observers, that most elephant researchers take it seriously rather than dismissing it as coincidence. Translation, in terms you can actually use, these animals appear capable of holding what looks suspiciously like a multi-year grudge against a specific vehicle's engine sound. Evolution didn't just build an animal capable of long-term memory, it potentially built an animal capable of long-term pettiness, which honestly feels like the most relatable trait on this entire list. Fast Fact 5. There are documented cases of elephants that experienced traumatic culling events as calves, surviving family members who watched relatives killed, showing measurable behavioral and physiological differences decades later as adults compared to elephants who didn't experience that trauma young. We're talking about trauma responses persisting essentially across an entire elephant generation, observable in adult behavior 30-plus years after the triggering event. That's not just remembering, that's something closer to what we'd call, in a human context, a lasting psychological imprint. Which brings us, slightly uncomfortably, back to me. Here's the thing nobody tells you about dying near a herd of elephants who are, by all available evidence, capable of holding grudges. You'd think she'd remember me too. You'd think the ghost of the guy who got swatted into a tree would be permanently on some elephant blacklist somewhere. But here's the surprisingly tender twist in this whole story. That very same matriarch, years later in elephant time, encountered another researcher who made nearly the same mistake I did, getting too close too fast. And instead of repeating the consequence, she gave a warning first this time. That mock charge from the very beginning of this video, the one where she stopped 20 feet short, exhaled, and walked away. I was there, invisible, watching it happen, watching a creature I'd personally been swatted by extend patience to someone else that she never got the chance to extend to me because I never gave her the time to. I don't know if that's growth, recalibration, or simple chance. I genuinely don't, but I like to think it's something. And either way, it taught me the actual lesson, late, extremely late, considering I was already dead by the time I learned it. 1. Distance is not optional. It's information. If a wild elephant tolerates your presence at a certain range, that range is a negotiated boundary, not an invitation to get closer. Closing that gap faster than the animal initiates is the single most common trigger for defensive behavior in documented encounters. 2. Ears and trunk position tell you more than trumpeting ever will. Spread ears and a raised trunk during a charge usually signal a mock or warning charge. Tucked ears, a curled trunk, and silence are the genuinely dangerous combination. Most documentary footage overemphasizes the loud, dramatic version and underemphasizes the quiet one that actually gets people hurt. 3. Vehicles and scent matter more than you think. If you're in a region with documented human-elephant conflict, the specific vehicle, color, or scent pattern associated with past negative encounters can trigger avoidance or aggression independent of anything you personally did. You can inherit a reputation you didn't earn. 4. Matriarchs are making decisions based on decades of memory you don't have access to. If the group suddenly shifts direction or behavior, there is very likely information behind that decision that simply isn't visible to you. Respect the shift instead of questioning it. 5. The quiet ones are still talking. Just because you can't hear a rumble doesn't mean a conversation isn't happening, possibly about you, possibly through the ground beneath your feet. Stillness is not silence in elephant terms. 6. Time doesn't erase memory here the way it might with other species. If a herd has reason to be cautious around humans, that caution can persist across individuals who personally did nothing to cause it. The fairest thing you can do is behave like every encounter is being permanently filed, because to them, it probably is. So that's the story of how a creature with a trunk full of 40,000 muscles, a memory system built on smell and infrasound, and apparently zero patience for line skippers taught me the actual lesson of my entire existence, sometimes literally. I've got eternity to keep watching this play out, herd after herd, decade after decade, and I'm honestly not mad about it. Best seats in the house, no reservation required. Although I'd still recommend, very strongly, that you keep your distance better than I did. If you want more videos like this,